For theoretical perspectives, we look at the biological perspective, the psychodynamic perspective of Freud, behavioral perspective, cognitive perspective, humanistic perspective, sociocultural perspective, as well as some acceptance-based perspectives. Biological approaches focuses on the roles of the nervous system, the body's physiological functioning, as well as genetics. The biological perspective believes that abnormalities in the body's functioning are responsible for the symptoms of the psychological disorders. The transmission of information throughout the nervous system takes place at the synapses. The synapses are points of communication between the neurons. And so psychologists, like I said, believe that these abnormalities in the body's functionings are responsible for symptoms that we see in the different psychological disorders, and perhaps these synapses or points of communication between the neurons are not functioning properly. Causes of nervous system dysfunction can range from genetic abnormalities to brain damage. Genes control manufacturing of neurotransmitters, the way the neurotransmitters behave in the synapse, how the brain's structures develop throughout life. The genotype is the genetic makeup of the organism. The allele is one of the two different variations of a gene. The polygenic is the model of inheritance in which more than one gene participates in the processing of determining a given characteristic. And then the phenotype is the expression of the genetic program in the individual's physical and psychological attributions. When we look at epigenetics, this attempts to identify the way that the environment influences genes to produce those phenotypes. Endophenotypes is the biobehavioral abnormalities that are linked to genetic and neurobiological causes of mental illness. The gene-environment correlations exist when people with a certain genetic predisposition are distributed unequally in particular environments. Passive exposure, niche picking, when the parents treat the children with certain genetic predispositions in particular ways because their abilities bring out particular responses. Gene-environment interactions occur when one factor influences the expressions of the other. Diathesis stress model proposal. This proposes that people are born with a predisposition that places them at risk for developing a psychological disorder if exposed to certain or extremely stressful life experiences. As you see here with epigenesis, this is the process through which the environment causes them to turn off or on the genes. The DNA this can turn off a gene as a chemical group. The methyl attaches itself to the gene, which is what you see in the diagram here. We've done quite a bit of family inheritance studies where researchers compare the disorder rates across relatives who have varying degrees of genetic relatedness. The genome-wide linkage study is where researchers study the families of people with specific psychological traits or psychological trait disorders. The genome-wide association studies is where researchers scan the entire genome of individuals who are not related to find the associated genetic variations with a particular disease. And then we see the single nucleotide polymorphism, which is a small genetic variation that can occur in a person's DNA sequence, or SNP for short. If we look at doing different types of treatments, we have a psychotherapeutic medications that we can give. These are somatic treatments that are intended to reduce the individual's symptoms by altering the levels of neurotransmitters that researchers believe are involved in the disorder. Psychosurgery, the purpose of this is to reduce the psychological disturbance. Psychosurgery or psychiatric neurosurgery is where the neurosurgeon operates on the brain regions that they feel are most likely responsible for the individual's symptoms. Deep brain stimulation is where the neurosurgeon implants a microelectrode that delivers a constant low electrical stimulation to a small region of the brain, powered by an implanted battery. Neuromodulation is a neurosurgery in which it permanently implanted electrodes which trigger responses in specific brain circuits as needed. And then the ECT, the electroconvulsive therapy, which is what you see here, is the application of electric shock to the head for the purpose of inducing therapeutically beneficial seizures. Art trait theory, we look at the 5-factor model, which is by Costa and McRae. There's an acronym for this, which is OCEAN, stands for openness, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So you either score low or you score high in each of these categories. According to this theory, each of the basic 5 dispositions has 6 facets, which leads to a total of 30 personality components. Canoe is another way to remember it. But there's a test that you can take, an assessment, that will tell you whether or not you score low or high in each of these categories to help shape your life. The personality trait in general is an enduring pattern of perceiving, relating to, and thinking about the environment as well as others. The trait theory approach proposes that abnormality occurs when the individual has maladaptive personality traits. Freud has many facets to the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic. It's sometimes referred to perspective. Back in the late 1800s is when he started to look at this in more depth. He began to explore the potential origins of psychological disorders through his clinical work and came up with various causes and treatment options for the psychological disorders that we were aware of at the time. He looked at the symptoms and often traced the root of the problem to the individual's past and often their childhood. Freud believes that the mind has 3 structures to it: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the personality that contains the sexual and aggressive instincts. This is also referred to as the pleasure principle. You can see in the cartoon clip here, it says, "I want it now." This is the motivating force oriented toward the immediate and total gratification of sensual needs and desires. Your libido is the instinctual pressure for gratification of sexual and aggressive desires. Your ego is the one in the middle. This is our reality principle. And this is the motivational or structure of personality, rather, that gives the individual the mental powers of judgment, memory, perception, and decision making, enabling the individual to adapt to the realities of the external world. This is known as the reality principle. It's motivational force that leads the individual to confront the constraints of the external world. It's the secondary process thinking, so kind of thinking involved in logical and rational problem solving. And then we have our superego here on the right, which is the moral side. You can't have it, it's not right. In psychoanalytic theory, the structure of personality that includes the conscience and the ego ideal. It incorporates societal prohibitions and exerts control over the seeking of instinctual gratification. So you have your id, which is very demanding and lives in the moment, doesn't think of consequences. The superego, which is the moral side, do what's right. And then your ego, which tries to balance out the 2 sides. Our defense mechanisms come into play to help keep out the unacceptable thoughts, the instincts, the feelings. Freud believed that people were primarily sexual and aggressive in our motives and needed to be protected from our unconscious desires. And those protections came through in our defense mechanisms. And so Freud came up with various defense mechanisms that helped us to protect us from giving into those unconscious desires. So the first one here, displacement, is where we take our unacceptable feelings or impulses from the target of those feelings to someone else that's less threatening, or to an object, right? We displace our feelings of anger onto someone else or something else. Intellectualization, we resort to excessive abstract thinking rather than focusing on the upsetting aspects of response to issues that cause conflict or stress. Reaction formation, think about opposite, the opposite to something. So we transform an unacceptable feeling or desire into its opposite in order to make it more acceptable. Repression deals with memory, so we take those disturbing wishes or thoughts or experiences from our awareness and push it into our unconscious mind. Denial, we take any kind of emotional conflict or stress and we refuse to acknowledge it. Projection is where we attribute undesirable personality traits or feelings and we project that onto somebody else and say that they're the ones that feel that way or think that way, not us. Sublimation is where we have an unacceptable impulse or desire, but we turn it into something that's socially appropriate. So you have somebody that is very sexual and they take that feeling of sexual desire and transform it into, works of art. Regression is where we deal with emotional conflict or stress by reverting to childlike behaviors. So we see this a lot when new siblings come along. You might have an older sibling that starts to act younger. So depending on what source you're looking at, there are other ones that pop up from Freud, but rationalization is one that we see often. That's not on this list, but and then Anna Freud too is Freud's daughter, and she also worked with defense mechanisms. So there's some other ones out there from her. A few criticisms of Freud. According to Carl Jung, the deepest layer of the unconscious includes images common to all human experience, which he called archetypes. Adler and Horney, the ego was the most important aspect of personality. They emphasized social concerns and interpersonal relations and the development of personality. Erickson gave greatest attention to the ego, or what he called ego identity. Ego psychology, this is a theoretical perspective based on psychodynamic theory, emphasizing the ego as the main force in personality. The term identity crisis is associated with Erickson, a task he believed was central to development in adolescence. Ego goes through a series of transformations throughout life in which a new strength or ability can mature. He also believed that each stage builds on one that precedes it and in turn influences all following stages. This list of theorists here are ones that felt that Freud focused too much on anything and everything sexual, and so that's why they're known as the Neo-Freudians, anti-Freud. Here we've got Mary Ainsworth that looked at attachment theory, that we have 3 types of attachment: secure, anxious, and avoidant. There's another one out there too that we see sometimes in sources, ambivalent. But object relations is where we see one's unconscious representations of important people in one's life. And so Ainsworth and her associates studied differences among infants in attachment style. Attachment is the way a person relates to the caregiver figure. And so if we have a secure attachment style, we relate to their close romantic partners without undue anxiety about whether or not their partners will care about them. If they have an anxious attachment style, they feel they cannot rely on their partner's love and support. And if they have an avoidant attachment style, they fear rejection from others and therefore try to protect themselves by remaining distant. So Freud's main goal of traditional psychoanalytic treatment, he used free association a lot in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. His method used here, which is where the client speaks freely, saying whatever comes to mind in free association. Key elements of psychodynamic therapy is to explore the client's emotional experiences, the use of defense mechanisms or close relationships with others' past experiences, exploration of fantasy life in dreams, daydreams, and fantasies. The clinician, the CCRT, the core conflictual relationship theme, is where the clinician assesses the client's wishes, expected responses from others, and client responses either to the responses of others or to the wish. The behavioral perspective looks back at your learning chapter from Intro to Psych. This is classical operant conditioning as well as social learning theory. Classical and operant conditioning was Ivan Pavlov and John Watson. Ivan Pavlov has the salivating dog experiment on the bottom here. This is the learning of a connection between an originally neutral stimulus and a naturally evoking stimulus that produces an automatic reflexive reaction. So you might remember terms like the UCS, the UCR, the CS, and the CR. That is your unconditioned stimulus, your unconditioned response, your conditioned stimulus, and your conditioned response. And then on the top left-hand corner, you see this is the Little Albert experiment by John Watson, where he conditioned little Albert to be fearful of furry things. And then in the middle, you see the Skinner box. This is operant conditioning. So Skinner used reinforcement and punishment to shape behavior, speaking that the hope of the reward was actually more important than the reward itself. And so intermittent reinforcement was very important in operant conditioning. And so you can't make the reinforcement so predictable. You know, you don't want to do it like every third time or every 5 minutes or anything like that, but it needs to be more sporadic. Social learning theory focuses on understanding how people develop psychological disorders through their relationships with others and observation of other people. So we look at Albert Bandura and the Bobo doll experiment, in which we learned more about observational learning, where the adult beat up on the Bobo doll and a group of children watched. And then we had the control group that did not watch the adult beat up on the doll. Both groups went into the room to play, and we observed their behaviors. The group that watched the adult beat up on the doll played more aggressively with the toys, including the verbal language, than the group that did not watch the adult beat up on the doll. For treatment under the behavioral perspective, we look at counter-conditioning, which is the process of replacing an undesired response to a stimulus with an acceptable response. Systematic desensitization, we present the client with progressively more anxiety-provoking images while in a relaxed state. Our contingency management is a principle of rewarding a client for desired behaviors and not providing rewards for undesired behaviors. Token economy is a client who performs desired activities, earns chips or tokens that can later be exchanged for tangible benefits. In the participant modeling is the therapist first shows the client a desired behavior, and then they guide the client through the behavioral change. Our cognitive perspective assumes that abnormality is caused by a maladaptive thought process that result in dysfunctional behavior. Automatic thoughts or ideas are so deeply entrenched that the individual is not even aware that they led to feelings of unhappiness and discouragement. Dysfunctional attitudes are personal rules that interfere with adequate adjustment. When we look at treatment, we look at cognitive restructuring. So clients have to learn to reframe their negative ideas into more positive ones. And we do this through cognitive behavioral therapy. So clinicians focus on changing both maladaptive thoughts as well as maladaptive behaviors. And the acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is where we help clients accept the full range of their subjective experiences as they commit themselves to tasks aimed at achieving behavior change that will lead to an improved quality of life. So the humanistic perspective, you can see this is Maslow's pyramid here on the right in the image. The humanistic perspective regards people as motivated by the need to understand themselves and the world and to derive greater enrichment from their experiences by fulfilling their need, their unique individual potential. And so Maslow has our self-actualization at the top. And so maximum realization of the individual's potential for psychological growth here. He says people are best able to experience self-actualization when they meet their basic physical and psychological needs. So people start at the bottom of this pyramid and they work their way up. Once they reach the physiological state, then they go to safety. Once that's done, they go to love and belonging. When they finish that, they go to esteem. When all four of those are done, they go to self-actualization. However, if, all of a sudden they're at the esteem and they lose their job, then they fall back to safety and they have to build their way back up again. So people are constantly moving up and down this pyramid all throughout life. It's not like you get to the top and stay there, but you're constantly fluctuating. The Carl Rogers is the one who does person-centered therapy. So he focuses on the uniqueness of each individual, the importance of allowing each individual to achieve maximum fulfillment of potential, and the need for the individual to confront honestly the reality of his or her experiences in the world. We do this through client-centered therapy, which is based on the belief by Rogers that people are innately good and that the potential for self-improvement lies within the individual. Conditions of worth, which is a term of Rogers, are demands that parents place upon children. We do motivational interviewing as part of this, or MI. It's a directive, which is client-centered style, for eliciting behavior change by helping clients explore and resolve any ambivalence that they feel. With our sociocultural perspective, we look at social discrimination, which is prejudicial treatment of a class of individuals seen in the sociocultural perspective as a cause of psychological problems. These psychological disorders can emerge as a result of destructive historical events, such as the violence of a political revolution, the turmoil of a natural disaster, or the poverty of a nationwide depression. Family therapy we can do, group therapy, milieu therapy, and multicultural approach. With family therapy, the therapist works with several or all members of the family. Group therapy, they facilitate discussion among several clients who talk about their problems together. The milieu therapy is an inpatient psychiatric facility in which all facets of the milieu or environment are components of the treatment. And the multicultural approach relies on awareness, knowledge, and skills of the client's sociocultural context.